Hello, hello, wonderful to have you here. In today's video, we have a very simple, direct question. What is a bodhisattva? Try to get into some of the details coming right up. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to this channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So many of us, when we think of Buddhism, we think of the Bodhisattva. Many of us will have heard of the word and perhaps wonder what it really means or want some more depth on what it might mean. We also may be interested in how the idea developed. Now, in today's video, I'm just going to get into what is a Bodhisattva. In my next video, I'll be dealing with the historical question of how this idea of a Bodhisattva, or what's called the Bodhisattva ideal, developed, so we can wait for that one. First of all, what does the term mean? Well, it's a compound term, Bodhi and Sattva. Sattva means a being, and Bodhi, well, I've done videos on that. It means either enlightenment or awakening. And so we might say, well, so this is a being who is, in some sense, related to awakening or enlightenment. It's perhaps a being who is directed towards enlightenment. Now, it's a little bit more than that. There's a lot of subtleties here, but that's a good start. It's a being headed towards enlightenment. So in Buddhism, bodhisattvas are discussed and praised widely across many different traditions and schools. Their icons and images will appear in their multitudes if you go to many Buddhist temples. And we'll see bodhisattvas and we'll also see Buddhas in these temples. We'll see manifestations or images of both of them. Now, what's exactly the difference between a bodhisattva and a Buddha? Well, we'll get to that eventually, but it's important at least to know that there is a distinction, a difference between these two. Now, historically, the ideal of the bodhisattva has tended to appear in mostly the Mahayana schools of Buddhism. These are the schools that flourished in particular in China, in Japan, in Korea, in Tibet, areas of, we might say, North Asia. However, it's also important to realize that there is a bodhisattva ideal as well within Theravada countries, Theravada schools of Buddhism. Those are the ones in Southeast Asia. So while the bodhisattva ideal is perhaps most famous in schools such as Zen, as Pure Land, and so on, it's also available in various schools that we might associate with mindfulness or with Vipassana, insight schools. It does occur broadly across Buddhism, so we shouldn't think that it's only in one particular school, this bodhisattva ideal. So what is the bodhisattva ideal? What is a bodhisattva? Well, it's many things to many different people. It's a very broad and deep kind of concept. And so I can only begin to scratch the surface in this kind of a video. However, the basic idea is that a bodhisattva puts off their own enlightenment for the sake of other sentient beings. That is to say, they put off their own enlightenment in order to help the rest of the world, in order to help other sentient beings. And the wish to do this, the wish to put off one's own enlightenment for the sake of others, is called bodhicitta, or the bodhi mind, or this kind of enlightened kind of mental state or mental capacity that allows us to look at the bigger picture. At least this is the understanding from within the bodhisattva ideal. From a traditional understanding, if we become enlightened, once we become enlightened, we're no longer reborn. That is traditionally the understanding. That certainly was the understanding in early Buddhism, that if you, the aim was to attain enlightenment or awakening, that once we did that, we would no longer be reborn, we would no longer be able to act within the world. Now, there are some later differences with respect to this. There are some later developments on that front, and I'll get to these later on in the video. But in any event, since one no longer was reborn and no longer could aid other people after one's death, once one had attained enlightenment, the attainment of enlightenment on a early Buddhist understanding was seen as therefore subtly egoistic, because one was only really out, in a sense, to help oneself by attaining enlightenment, and then one could no longer help others, at least after one died. So this was seen as somewhat egoistic, somewhat selfish, to aim at that kind of end, at least within schools of the Mahayana, within schools that are, or at least within practitioners who adopted the Bodhisattva ideal. And indeed, it eventually came to be something that one had to make promises about. In other words, that adopting the Bodhisattva ideal wasn't simply a matter of deciding to practice in a certain way, but that one was also expected to take certain vows, take certain promises, to make the vow, the promise to stay with it, as it were, in the long term. The vow, I believe, was expected to give one further energy and stick-to-itiveness, shall we say, in the longer term, because this path of the Bodhisattva ideal was going to be very, very long in terms of lifetimes, shall we say. So, for example, there are many different translations and interpretations of these Bodhisattva ideals, but one that I have heard many times and find interesting is from the Zen tradition. Here, this is a translation, a version found from the Zen Mountain Monastery, and it goes like this. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to save them. Desires are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. The dharmas are boundless. I vow to master them. The Buddha way is unattainable. I vow to attain it. So these vows are typically paradoxical from a kind of a Zen perspective. As many of us may know, the Zen approach is a very paradoxical approach to the Dharma. That's kind of how they like to interpret things, using these kinds of paradoxes. But in any event, this particular formulation of the vows does suggest that the path is basically endless. That when one becomes a bodhisattva, one is at least potentially going to be on that path of practice forever, for an potentially infinite number of lifetimes. At least that seems to me to be the suggestion here. More accurately, however, the Bodhisattva ideal was an ideal aimed at becoming a full Buddha. So it was seen that in early Buddhism, in other schools, shall we say, other interpretations, one was simply aimed at becoming enlightened, an enlightened person. The Pali word, or the word is arahant, the Pali word is arahant, arhat in Sanskrit. This is a person, simply I shouldn't say normal, but a relatively normal person who becomes enlightened. Whereas the Bodhisattva is not aimed at that end. The Bodhisattva is aimed at the end of becoming a full Buddha. Now, I've done a video in the past on the difference between Buddhas and enlightened beings, but in general, the idea here is that an enlightened person was somebody who had learned the Dharma from somebody else, or perhaps had discovered it for themselves, but had decided not to teach. They were basically either lone Buddhas, or they were considered lone Buddhas in the sense that they had discovered it for themselves, but they did not teach, or that they had learned it from somebody else and become enlightened, and maybe taught a few people, but didn't found a religion, as it were. Whereas a full Buddha was somebody who had discovered the Dharma in a time and age when it was unknown, and then presented it to the world, founded a Sangha, a world Sangha, taught it to many, many people, became a voice for the Dharma in a world that didn't know it. That at least was the original kind of difference between the two in a nutshell. So what this suggests, at the very least, is that if one is going to undertake this bodhisattva ideal to become a Buddha, one is going to have to wait an extraordinarily large number of lifetimes until the Dharma was no longer known, and then be in a position to be reborn in that situation and discover the Dharma anew and transmit it to the world. So this was potentially a very, very long path, and therefore one that would take a lot of preparation to master, shall we say. And one of the aspects of this mastery that went along with the Bodhisattva ideal was an idea that one had to perfect certain things. One had to undertake the perfection of what are called the paramitas, or the perfections of virtue, essentially. And so the Bodhisattva path sort of dovetailed with a practice of what are called these perfections. Now, there are different lists of these perfections that we can find, but they don't stem from early Buddhism. They came somewhat later and seem to have arisen around this notion of the Bodhisattva ideal, of one trying to make oneself a Buddha. And what are the perfections? Again, there are different lists, but essentially they are virtues such as patience, generosity, ethics, wisdom, the ability to meditate, this kind of ability to become calm and concentrated. These kinds of skills, of abilities, of perfected virtues, they were all there. I mean, we can certainly say they were there from the beginning of Buddhism, but they were never really put into a list until this Bodhisattva ideal began to gain traction. And the idea was that once one perfected them, one became a Buddha. So essentially a Buddha was a being who had perfected these paramitas, these perfections, who had perfected these virtues. That's essentially what it was from the inside, as it were, to be a Buddha. Now, in later Mahayana, the idea also arose that there were two levels of nirvana. That the earlier idea that once one attained nirvana and died, one could no longer remain active in the world, that was a lower level of nirvana. That then there was also a higher non-abiding or apratistita nirvana that one could attain to, in which one, after attaining it, one could remain active in the world. So an idea arose again in the later Mahayana that a Buddha, if attaining to this higher nirvana, could then remain active in the world and help other beings, even after having attained it. Or that is to say, after having attained it and died, so that even after death, one could still remain active and help other beings. Now, much of this Bodhisattva ideal arose alongside the what would appear to be the construction of stories about the Buddha's past lives. One of these stories involved Dipankara Buddha, who is said to have been a Buddha who existed many eons ago, and that Gautama, the Buddha that we know, the Buddha Gautama, in a past life, met Dipankara, and Dipankara told Gautama, or the person who would become Gautama, that he would become a Buddha. In other words, there was a prediction made to this person who would become Gautama that he would become a Buddha in a future life. So this story, having been written down and composed and having made its effect, some believers in this ideal of the Bodhisattva believe that the way to really become a Bodhisattva, you have to actually find a living Buddha and express your desire, your vow to attain Buddhahood. You have to essentially make these Bodhisattva vows or something equivalent to them in front of a living Buddha, and that living Buddha then has to make the prediction that you will succeed. That's the only way, at least according to some believers in this Bodhisattva ideal, that's the only real way to be a Bodhisattva. I believe that this kind of view is mostly held within Theravada countries, within Theravada believers in this ideal. Insofar as we're going to hold to such an ideal, we're going to hold that the Bodhisattva ideal is really almost vanishingly small in terms of numbers of people who actually attain to it, in the sense that, how many of us will ever have the chance to actually meet a full Buddha? And of those people who can, how many of them will gain the prediction that, yes, you will also become a Buddha in a future life? But in any event, I wanted to leave that out there as one footnote to what the Bodhisattva ideal means to some practitioners. Now, I've gotten into a little bit of the history here of this Bodhisattva ideal, but in my next video what I want to do is to get into some of this in more detail, because there's a lot to be said about this development of this ideal over time in the early Sangha, the Sangha that persisted after the Buddha's lifetime. So I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen when it's available. Take a look, and if you're getting something out of these videos, consider also taking a look over at my Patreon page meanwhile, and seeing if you want to help out the channel and the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.